to move to public comments and discussion. And so I'm going to introduce individuals who are kind of pre-registered to make comments, and then I would just remind every speaker to declare any potential conflict of interest before delivering remarks. So the first pre-registered public commenter is Melissa Hamilton from BMS.
Good morning. I just want to confirm that I'm on here and that you can hear me okay.
You're on. I would say we can hear you okay. There's
okay. Okay, let's see if we can get closer. Hopefully that's better.
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. My name is Melissa Hamilton, Executive Director for the US HEOR Immunology team at Bristol Myers Squibb, BMS. My conflicts of interest are employment and stock ownership with BMS. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this review. We appreciate ICER's commitment to open dialogue and feedback, and would like to reflect on two important limitations of the evaluation as it was conducted. First, BMS believes that addressing unmet medical needs and preventing disability is crucial to patients with MS, as well as their physicians and caregivers. In this ICER review, the central measure of disability, also known as confirmed disability progression, or CDP, is based on the expanded disability status scale, which focuses on physical function. However, as ICER acknowledges, and is noted in recently published MS studies, there are other important markers of quality of life and disease progression, such as cognition and fatigue, that should be considered because of the profound impact they have on patients with MS. Research has shown that brain volume loss may be associated with long-term worsening disability. Therefore, a key limitation is that this review did not consider additional markers of quality of life and disease progression. In addition to improvements in disability, it is also important to consider the safety profile of the treatments provided, which was not assessed in great detail as part of this review, but would have provided a much more comprehensive view of MS treatments. The second key limitation of the evaluation is that it relies only on comparative clinical evidence that could be generated using the network meta-analysis methodology, or NMA. While we acknowledge that NMA is a valid method of comparison, it can have weaknesses that should be kept in context. There are other available methods of indirect comparison that provide additional information not contained in the report. First, NMA does not account for heterogeneity in patient characteristics across trials that can have an impact on the comparison of interest. We appreciate that ICER has acknowledged this in the limitations of the report. Matching adjusted indirect comparison, or MAIC, as an example of an alternative method has been utilized in this space and can be reviewed in the literature. MAIC enables using individual patient-level data from one trial to adjust for differences in patient characteristics to compare to summary statistics reported from another trial. This adjustment for patient characteristics can have a substantial impact on the results of the comparison. While we acknowledge that ICER would not have had access to individual patient-level data across manufacturers, published literature on other methods of indirect comparison can be reviewed to provide additional context about the relative efficacy and safety profile of treatments in MS. Second, performing an NMA can inadvertently exclude some outcomes of interest from the analysis because it requires a connected evidence network and common reporting of the outcome across numerous trials. Across trials, comparators are quite variable and endpoints are reported inconsistently. Feasibility for comparison of many relevant endpoints becomes very challenging in the framework of an NMA, but this does not mean that the body of evidence should be excluded from consideration. In this evidence review, several endpoints that are relevant to the treatment of MS, such as cognition, brain volume loss, fatigue, and risk of infection are not considered in the NMA. In addition, safety was not thoroughly evaluated in the NMA. However, these endpoints have been considered in other analyses, such as several MAICs that have been reported in the literature for treatments for relapsing forms of MS. Additionally, the NMA in this review did not allow for the evaluation of long-term safety data, which is more challenging when trying to evaluate all treatments in a connected network of the NMA. This information would have provided a more balanced and complete understanding of the risk-benefit profiles of the therapies in this evaluation. In summary, technical challenges in the assessment conducted by ICER precluded the consideration of important clinical outcomes such as fatigue, cognition, long-term safety, and brain volume preservation, all of which are important aspects of a patient's MS journey. To address these challenges, alternative data sources and methods should be considered to allow for a more comprehensive evaluation of the relative value of the treatments for MS. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks for your comments, and thanks for coming, and thanks for staying under 5 minutes. It's always hard for me to interrupt, so I appreciate it. Maybe we should get a response from the ICER research team.
I will start. I can address some of the NMA comments. We appreciate the efforts of reviewing our NMA. As you mentioned, these are always complicated networks, and we did do some sensitivity analyses, as I mentioned, that address some of your concerns about comparability. It is true that MS trials over the years, there's a lot of heterogeneity, primarily from the patient population perspective, because the diagnostic criteria have changed as well, and there's not much we can do about that. In terms of the matching adjusted indirect comparison that you mentioned some of the advantages, but from our standpoint, it requires patient level data. And so we didn't have access to patient level data. So we weren't able to take advantage of that particular methodology. I'll also note that NMA has the advantage that it allows us to incorporate multiple treatments. And so that is another advantage of NMA. So between the sensitivity analyses that we did, the similarity of our NMA results to other NMAs that have been published, we think that this is without the patient level data, this was our best bet for doing the indirect comparisons, because we didn't have head-to-head trial data.
Thank you so much. Any additional comments, or else we'll move on to the next public commenter?
I actually wanted to invite Mel. I think some of the CEPAC might benefit from hearing about the utility structure of the EDSS health states. Because my understanding is that those would have captured other effects such as cognition and other things, even though we're not measuring those directly and somehow adding them to the EDSS states. They should reflect the utilities of patients who are experiencing those outcomes as well. So it's not like they're mutually exclusive, but let Mel comment on that.
I don't think I could say that more beautifully and eloquently than Steve, but yes, so our health state utilities, if you think back to that slide, they do decrease over time, and are captured using methods that are then mapped to patients at that EDSS state. And so it should be implied that there are capturing those other functions as well.
Can I just add that the utility range is also very wide for this disease state, as presented by Mel's slide on utilities. So it's important to think about that as well, that EDSS range and the utilities associated with those do go very low in our scales, down close to zero with the end states. And so, so just keep that in mind as well, that those things, at least to the extent that EDSS is associated with cognition and fatigue, are built into a structure in which a treatment would slow that progression.
Can I comment on that? Because the study that was used to generate those was an old UK study in which people with MS were asked to estimate the quality of life based on EDSS. And EDSS, they actually had negative values for EDSS's 8 and above, 8 and 9 essentially. And so a different method was used to create positive values for those. Having said that, when you get into that range of the EDSS, it's all defined by physical mobility. And so it really doesn't capture the impairments from cognition and fatigue at that point.
EDSS does not, but the measures of quality of life that were being assigned to those individuals did. And so there's a difference. The EDSS does not, but if individuals were experiencing fatigue and cognition impairment with a large EDSS score, then those would come through in an understanding of the utility.
Well, depending on how that utility was derived, right?
Correct.
Okay, with that, I just want to make sure we get all the public speakers in. Let me move on to Kyle Hviston from Sanofi. And just your financial conflict of interest at the beginning.
Indeed, they are available on the slide. So thank you to members of the New England CEPAC and to our colleagues from ICER for holding this public meeting. My name, as you can see, is Kyle Hviston, and I'm the head of the Sanofi Health Economics and Value Assessment Group. I'm very pleased to participate in today's discussion. Before we get started, I would just like to reflect on how far we've come in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. It was not too long ago, in fact, 1991, in fact, that Fraser Robinson died of complications related to his MS. He was only 55 years old, and he happened to be the father of a former First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama. Yet, in the approximately 30 years since that time, MS patients can now expect to reach an average life expectancy. This dramatic improvement in outcomes is due to the innovations that we are discussing today. This truly inspires a sense of awe in me, although we have a great deal of work ahead of us. We don't yet have a cure, but there are treatments available that slow down disease progression, as we have discussed, and delay the disability associated with MS. Today, we would like to make 3 points that we hope don't get lost as we consider all the details of this very comprehensive report. First, despite the number of MS treatments that are available, there is no single treatment that can halt or reverse MS, and thus we are not done developing new treatments. Second, MS is an extremely heterogeneous disease, as we've discussed, and there are no treatments that can address all of the individual needs of all MS patients. And lastly, because there's no silver bullet that works in all MS patients, it's important that access policies provide coverage despite specific MS phenotypes. Today, we can celebrate the fact that over 20 diverse MS treatments have been approved in the US. At Sanofi, we have been privileged to be a part of the scientific community that is contributing to the expansion of treatment options. First, with the approval of teriflunomide in 2012, and then amliteuzumab in 2014. While we feel proud of our contribution so far, we remain committed to MS, and we continue to develop new treatments such as tolebrutinib, an investigational novel mechanism of action, which is a brain-penetrant BTK inhibitor with CNS immunomodulation being studied in relapsing forms of MS, primary progressive MS, and secondary progressive MS. Additionally, we are currently in early stages of investigation for other novel mechanisms of action to treat MS. Sanofi continues to invest not only in developing new treatments, but also in generating evidence on how our medicines perform in clinical practice, especially in outcomes that matter most to patients, such as disability progression, quality of life, and the ability to engage in daily activities. For example, teriflunomide has over 100 publications based on clinical trials, open label extensions, registries, and real-world evidence. Despite patent expiration, we're continuing our registry partnerships in the US and around the world. For new treatments to be evaluated thoroughly and fairly, it's important to include patient-reported outcomes in their assessment, as we have discussed. As ICER points out in its report, preventing or slowing disability progression, for example, in preventing fatigue or reduced cognition, are important outcomes for patients like Dr. Hirschfeld and to clinicians as well. Given the importance of this outcome and the constant innovation in endpoint development, we encourage ICER to continuously update its approach for quantifying clinical value, make sure that it includes what matters most to patients and it's accurately reflected in its findings. Specifically, we recommend the use of confirmed disability improvement, as Dr. Lin noted. In its report, ICER recognizes the heterogeneity of MS and the importance of allowing physicians and patients to make joint decisions on treatments that work best for their unique circumstances. Formulary policies must be sufficiently flexible to ensure there are enough options for patients without going through a maze of administrative access barriers. During today's discussion, we encourage ICER and other stakeholders to ensure that this report's findings are not misused to establish barriers to access. As a company dedicated to discovering and developing new treatments for diseases with high unmet need, we believe there is need for novel treatment options for patients living with MS. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion, and I welcome any questions from the panel.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll quickly move on. Just wanted to scan here. Okay, I think barring any questions, let me move on to Ashish Pradhan from Genentech, and just please a reminder to state your conflict of interest.
Hi, I'm Ashish Pradhan. I'm a full-time employee of Roche, and I own Roche stock as being an employee of Roche. Good morning. My name is Ashish Pradhan, and I'm the Executive Medical Director for Neuroimmunology in US Medical Affairs at Genentech. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on ICER's assessment of oral and monoclonal antibodies for relapsing forms of multiple sclerosis, including Ocrevus. At Genentech, we are committed to delivering innovative and transformative treatments for patients with MS. Our goal throughout this assessment has been to ensure that people living with MS and their providers are equipped with fair, balanced information and have access to the life-changing medicines they need. Ocrevus is the first and only FDA-approved disease-modifying therapy that is indicated for the treatment of both relapsing forms and primary progressive MS. We are confident in the value that Ocrevus continues to bring to patients since its approval in 2017, which is underscored with nearly 6 years of post-launch real-world experience and with more than 500,000 patient years of exposure supporting its safety and effectiveness. Genentech remains committed to improving care for people living with MS. We demonstrate our commitment with more than 30 ongoing clinical trials, including some in diverse or underserved patient populations, investments in real-world evidence to close evidence gaps, support for digital tools for disease monitoring, and by advancing the science with innovative new therapies in development. We recognize the need to better understand the relative value of the many treatment options for MS, which motivated ICER's assessment, but we offer caution about the interpretation of the results. While the clinical review employs accepted standard methodologies for indirect treatment comparisons, these methods are contingent on the similarity of the underlying data and existing evidence. This is a challenge in conducting an assessment in a heterogeneous and evolving disease area with limited head-to-head trial data such as MS. Specifically, we highlight 3 areas of concern that should be taken into consideration by users of ICER's report. First, disparate trial populations due to changes in diagnostic criteria and ethical considerations of enrolling patients into placebo-controlled trials. Second, cross-trial differences in the definitions of relapse and progression outcomes. And 3, shortcomings of EDSS as a holistic measure of disease progression. Furthermore, we underscore that this review does not evaluate the full breadth of evidence available when considering clinical value. Clinical confidence has been gained and additional benefits have been demonstrated for products like Ocrevus that have significant time on market, and this information may be of critical importance to patients and healthcare decision makers when selecting a treatment. Specifically, the broader value of Ocrevus beyond pivotal trial data has been demonstrated with 9 years of long-term extension data, studies of long-term adherence and persistence, and real-world evidence of clinical and economic benefit with use of Ocrevus earlier in the treatment paradigm. These limitations of the clinical review have implications for the economic assessment of value. As ICER states, the cost-effectiveness analysis is primarily driven by the results of the network meta-analysis for progression. In the clinical review, ICER concludes that there is insufficient evidence to differentiate the net health benefit of ublituximab from the other monoclonal antibodies. However, by providing a single price benchmark in the economic review, this may mislead readers to presume clinical equivalence of the monoclonal antibodies. This conclusion is not supported by the existing body of evidence and is a notable concern in the case of obinutuzumab, which failed to demonstrate a significant impact on disability progression in clinical trials, an endpoint of critical importance to patients. In closing, the limitations discussed result in substantial uncertainty and bias in the conclusions of the assessment. Challenges in comparing cross-trial evidence often exist, given the nature of incremental innovation. It is thus essential that end users consider the totality of evidence that contributes to a treatment's benefit-risk ratio. Genentech thus remains committed to ongoing evidence generation efforts, and we feel strongly that treatment choice should be left to people with MS and their healthcare providers, considering individual patients' needs and preferences. We thank you for the opportunity to provide comments.
Thank you for your comments and for coming. We are over time here, but maybe I could allow a brief moment if anyone from the ICER team wants to comment. If not, feel free not to, and we'll just have one more speaker. Okay, it looks like we're passing for now. We can obviously talk more later. The last public commenter is Bari Talente.
Yes. Hi, I'm Bari Talente. I have no conflicts to disclose, and I'm employed by the National Multiple Sclerosis Society and also serve as president of the MS Coalition. I'm delivering testimony on behalf of the MS Coalition, a 501c3 network of 9 MS organizations. The MS community shares ICER's interest in promoting value in healthcare. In our view, value is obtaining optimal healthcare outcomes by ensuring people have access to the right care and treatment for them, which includes both appropriate pricing for medications and systems and policies that allow for personalized approaches as warranted. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to provide comments on ICER's evidence report. As the report states, MS is a highly heterogeneous disease. Clinical practice guidelines recommend considering the risks and benefits of each treatment strategy on a patient-by-patient basis. Factors that should be considered include the disease course, life circumstances, patient preferences, tolerance, the likelihood of adherence, side effects, and treatment goals. The MS Coalition does not advocate for any specific MS disease-modifying treatment, or DMT. As ICER concluded, all the DMTs analyzed demonstrate clinical effectiveness. We believe patients should have access to a full range of treatments. Aside from ublutuximab, all DMTs have real-world data available. It would have been useful to integrate those data into ICER's model. In a lifelong progressive disease, relying on a 2-year clinical trial snapshot is not sufficient to make recommendations that could impact treatment decision-making. Additional insights into patient outcomes and the value of different sequences would have provided information that is more useful to the MS community. While we appreciate ICER including a brief section on other patient-centered outcomes, we believe ICER could do more to advocate for the importance of these data in clinical trials and health technology assessments. I want to now turn my attention to the voting questions, specifically those under the contextual considerations and potential other benefits or disadvantages section. In the response to public comments, ICER shared its desire to keep these questions consistent across all disease states. In our view, that makes the job of each panel more difficult. In the first question, the response option focuses on short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability. In fact, DMTs are not intended to reduce the risk of death. As you've heard, data is stronger on relapse rates than confirmed disability progression, but both measures are believed to reduce progression to permanent disability. While the EDSS scale tends to focus on physical disability, both physical and cognitive disability can severely impact the life of someone with MS. In a recent survey the MS Coalition did of people with MS, the loss of independence was selected as a top area of concern, which could occur from either physical or cognitive disability. You'll also be asked to vote on the long-term value for money at the current pricing of ublutuximab versus dimethyl fumarate. It would be simple to consider the low pricing of a generic dimethyl fumarate, and that is certainly part of the assessment, but it is much more nuanced. This report and other data sources indicate that some people with MS need high efficacy treatment like the monoclonal antibodies. Getting people on the right treatment for them ultimately is a better value for the individual and the healthcare system. We'll talk later about insurance barriers, but I did want to note a few relevant data points from the survey I mentioned. 30% of those with MS who responded to the survey reported that their current or past insurer had rejected coverage for their disease-modifying treatment. 49% of respondents had discontinued their DMT at some point. The number 2 reason given for discontinuation was side effects. And among discontinuers, 38% reported new or worsening symptoms during the time that they had discontinued a DMT. Side effects are an important concern for patients, often not given enough weight during utilization management or HTAs, but we know they have a real-world impact on individuals and at a health population and system level. It's important to note that although many common side effects are relatively benign and include headaches and flu-like symptoms, very serious side effects also occur, including flushing and gastrointestinal issues, depression or other behavioral health problems, liver problems, heart problems, and more. I would like to conclude with the words of people living with MS. First, it's a terrible worry that you will be denied coverage for your DMT and you're not able to afford self-pay. And that's the best way we have of slowing progression. And living with MS is life-changing. Prior to my diagnosis, I maintained a full-time job, traveled to watch my sons play sports, and ran my household and had really good friendships. Since my diagnosis, I'm not able to work. I cannot travel long distances, and life as I knew it no longer exists. I try to have a good attitude and stay positive, but it is very hard to do.
Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for joining us. We are a few minutes over for lunch, but I just wanted to see if there were any questions or comments. Obviously, these public comments from patients, patient groups, and pharmaceutical companies are incredibly enriching to our dialogue and conversation. Any questions or comments from the CEPAC or from the ICER staff?
Jason, I'd like to just thank Bari and the MS Coalition for the collaboration on this work and for representing those comments that she just gave. So thank you for the positive collaboration and for contributing and making our work better.
Fantastic. Other comments or questions, or should we transition to lunch? I'm just looking through I don't see any hands up. So with that,
So Jason, thank you. Let me just because we're a little bit late, I'll go ahead and jump in to say we will still reconvene at 12:45 to start the further conversation. Barry's comment is a great launching point for some of the votes that will be a discussion that will occur after we come back from lunch. So we'll see everybody back at 12:45 Eastern time.
thank you all.